USDA logo, United States Department of Agriculture.
Good morning. We will begin shortly. This presentation is being recorded. Please place yourself on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you have accommodations needs, please refer to the instructions on the screen. These instructions will also be placed in the chat for future reference. And I would now like to introduce Paul Wester, the Director of the National Agricultural Library.
Good morning, and thank you, Wendy. As Wendy said, my name is Paul Wester. I'm the Director of the National Agricultural Library here in Beltsville, Maryland, and I would like to welcome you to our event, Maize, an Introduction to the History and Culture of Corn and Maize. I'm glad that you could join with us this morning. Before we proceed any further, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement to the Piscataway peoples on whose ancestral lands our facility is situated here in Beltsville, Maryland. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. We believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised, so we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous lands that were stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Next, a little bit about the National Agricultural Library, or as we sometimes call it, NAL. It was established 160 years ago this week, or at least the functions for the library were, on May 15th, 1862, by President Abraham Lincoln with the creation of the United States Department of Agriculture. Today, as a part of USDA's Agricultural Research Service, the National Agricultural Library is one of 5 national libraries in the United States and holds one of the most extensive food and agriculture collections in the world. Serving USDA scientists and administrators, researchers, and the public, the library facilitates the creation of agricultural knowledge through the acquisition, curation, and dissemination of agricultural data and information in all of its varying forms. Today's event kicks off the first of our 3-part webinar series. The webinar series is entitled Maize, Corn, Its Science, Culture, and Cuisine. Through this series, we will explore maize and corn as a global food staple and its role in food, culture, and society. We will also cover the USDA priority areas around sustainability, environmental and social justice, and nutrition security during these events today and the 2 future webinars. During today's first webinar, we will explore the history of maize and corn and learn about domestication, versatility, and diversification. We will learn about current research addressing the challenges with maize and corn production, as well as discover the crop's adaptability to ever-changing climate conditions. And we will learn how indigenous and Western knowledge systems can come together to inform and benefit each other today. Historically, corn has been a pillar of American agriculture. It will continue to be it will continue to play an important role in the U.S. and in feeding the world for years to come. So we must learn how it affects us today and how it may affect us in the future. Now on to an overview of today's program. First, we will hear from Dr. Dolores Paperno, Senior Scientist and Curator of South American Archaeology Emerita from the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, Panama. Dr. Paperno's research interests include archaeology and the human ecology of the lowland American tropics. A current project investigates teosinte and maize growth and phenotypic plasticity in the conditions in which they were first collected and cultivated by human populations. Following Dr. Paperno, Dr. Jim Holland will speak. Dr. James Holland is a research geneticist in plants with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Holland's recent research topics include genomic selection, genetics of disease resistance, and genotype environment interactions in maize. Our final speaker today will be Electa Hare Redcorn, a natural resource program specialist at the Intertribal Agriculture Council and a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and a descendant of the Apawan Dakota people. Since 2012, Ms. Hare Redcorn has assisted the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society as a mentor for Pawnee women returning to agriculture and traditional agricultural knowledge. She has worked with the Intertribal Agriculture Council since 2019, where she oversees internship programs in natural resources, supports graduate students in food and agriculture, and provides technical support to native agriculture producers entering into USDA and in particular Natural Resource Conservation Service or NRCS programs and services. So a big welcome to Dolores, Jim, and Electa for our program today. On our program process, each speaker is going to have a 10 to 15 minute presentation, followed by a short question and answer period, which I'll moderate. During the presentations, feel free to post questions for the presenters in the chat, and the questions will be compiled during the presentation. And at the end of the presentations, I'll engage with the speakers on those questions that we have from the audience. And time permitting, at the end of our session today, we'll have a combined question and answer session where we'll have questions for everybody and maybe some interaction between the speakers themselves. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Dolores Paperno, Senior Scientist and Curator of South American Archaeology, Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, Panama. Take it away, Dolores.
First of all, thanks very much to the organizers, to Wendy and the other organizers of my talk. I'm very happy to be here for this interesting. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm just going to give a very brief history of maize from its initial domestication up to around 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and then Jim's going to take over. Just to talk a little bit about where it was domesticated, when it was domesticated, how it was domesticated, and then its initial dispersions from Mexico, its homeland, into South America. We know that the origins and dispersals of agriculture beginning 10,000 years ago was really one of the most transformative events in human and ecological history. It was the beginning of the epoch now called the Anthropocene. And an agricultural food base allowed the cultural developments integral to the ways of living for many of us: sedentary, non-mobile lifestyles, food storage, craft specialization, large urban settlements, state societies, the complex institutions. These are all made possible because around 10,000 years ago across the world, and you can see some of the areas where farming began. And of course, maize was a very, very important crop. Where was maize domesticated? We originally thought it was a highland. It was originally brought under cultivation and domesticated in the dry highland zones of Mexico, these areas here in black. But we know now that it was domesticated in the neotropical lowlands, the lowlands of Tropic America, right here in the Balsas Valley rivershed of Mexico. That's where it was domesticated. And we didn't know that until geneticists about 15 to 20 years ago started studying the modern wild varieties of corn. And they determined that modern day corn was genetically closest to the varieties of teosinte. Maize's wild ancestor is called teosinte. This was where it was domesticated, right here. And these are some of the early important archaeological sites showing maize domestication, and then early maize use. Okay. Maize moved to Panama by 7,600 years ago. It was domesticated, as I'll show you, by 9,000 years ago. And we think that maize probably moved right along the Pacific coast between 9,000 and 7,600 years ago. This area of Mexico is a seasonally dry area. It's not a rainforest. Not all tropical forests are rainforests. This area gets a very long dry season. And its wild ancestor, at least its progenitor, is adapted to the dry season. Now, wild ancestors of crops that still can be found on landscapes today are very important in crop breeding and improvement. They contain genetic material for responses to abiotic and biotic stressors that was bred out of crops by early and later farmers. And it's interesting, there is a century-long debate about maize's ancestry that occurred in large part because today they're so different from one another. So if you were to go to Israel and Jordan and see wild wheat and barley, you would say, oh, there's wild wheat and barley, because in many of its phenotypic or visible characteristics, it just looks like wheat and barley. Modern teosinte today looks very different from corn in a number of ways, although its seeds are still very similar to maize. And you can see the wild corn, teosinte, has no cob. So there are enormous phenotypic transformations that took place. And we know now from some studies I've done, I and colleagues have done, growing teosinte under simulated lower CO2 and temperature conditions that existed 9,000 to 10,000 years ago when people first started cultivating. We know now that the teosinte was much more variable than this, and actually it had some traits we thought were domestication traits. I don't have time to go into that, but there's some things changing about this story. But teosinte, the fruits of the inflorescences of teosinte today are still very different from modern maize. Wild maize had no cob. So you can see the transformations that people undertook starting 10,000 years ago when they began to cultivate maize. How do we study the history of maize? Well, we have to find archaeological sites where early farmers lived. The geneticists working on maize and teosinte told us where to go. We rely on genetic evidence, of course. We study the plant fossils from early archaeological sites, and these fossils could be what we call macrofossils, divisible like cobs. Cobs and seeds and husks and leaves you can hold in your hand. What's become very important in the past 20 years are studies of microfossils, the fossils of maize and other plants that you need a microscope to study. And they include starch grains, which is what gives the seed its energy. We all know what starch is, right? And these starch grains are microscopic. Here they are here. And here are some squash phytoliths. Phytoliths are silicified remains of plants that stay in. And these microfossils survive a very long period of time, including in the humid environments that maize was domesticated in. So they've given us the early evidence of maize. And you can see how small these are. So these scale bars, 10 microns, 50 microns, 1,000 microns equals a millimeter, 25,400 microns equals an inch. So these microfossils of corn and other crops we study, they're very small, but they're very highly diagnostic, which is nice. And then we can study from these early archaeological sites, grinding stones, human teeth, and soils, all for these microfossil remains. And it's given us a lot of evidence we didn't have before about 15 to 20 years ago. It's interesting because the earliest sites with maize and other farming in the neotropics are often caves and rock shelters. So here's the site, the Xihuatoshla rock shelter in this region of Mexico, the central Balsas River Valley, where maize was domesticated. And this site does contain so far the earliest maize evidence. We got this evidence from the microfossils, the phytoliths and starch grains. Goes back about 8,700 years ago. By this time, maize is at least semi-domesticated. So we think the cultivation must have started earlier. So I don't think we found the earliest cultivation and indications of domesticated corn quite yet. We can say it was at least partially domesticated by 8,700 years ago. These are some of the plant grinding stones that we studied from the Xihuatoshla shelter. These are some of the earliest plant grinding implements in the New World. This is what people use to process plants. And then we study the surfaces of these tools, and we find the maize and other crop plant remains right on them. Okay. And then this is the Agua Dulce rock shelter in Central Pacific Panama. I and colleagues did a number of years ago. And this is the earliest evidence of corn in southern Central America going back 7,600 years ago. These are where the early farmers lived. They didn't live in sedentary villages yet. They existed in small family groups. And this is what our earliest farmers were like in the tropical forests of the Americas. The earliest maize macrofossils, the cobs we can hold in our hand and see, are from the arid Mexican highlands. These cobs don't survive where maize was domesticated because the humidity just deteriorates them and we can't find them. But these are some maize cobs from very famous sites in the Tehuacan Valley in the arid regions of Mexico, San Marcos Cave. And even by 5,300 years ago, you can see how small these cobs are. These cobs are only, sorry for that phone, I have problems with my phone. These cobs are only a couple centimeters long, 5,300 years ago. Maize stayed very small for a long time. It took a long time for maize to grow into the cob we know today. And we know that the domestication of maize and other cereals didn't happen in a single step, but took place over thousands of years. And these are the very earliest maize macrofossils from Mexico, dating to 6,200 years ago. And you can see how small and primitive these things are. I really apologize for that phone. I thought I turned it off. Now, these are the earliest maize cobs in South America from a site in coastal Peru. 6,600 years ago, 5,400 years ago, which is the same date as these cobs I just showed you from highland Mexico. These cobs are more advanced, probably because maize has moved out of its center, out of its center of origin, gone through down lower Central America into northern South America, and it didn't have an opportunity to hybridize with its wild ancestor. So people were able, hold on, I can't, let me just continue this. People were more able to select certain traits that made the cob larger. This cob here has 10 rows of grains. These cobs here only have 4 to 8 rows of grains. So we can see how maize was able to really advance as a domesticate when it left Mexico and wasn't able to hybridize with its wild ancestor anymore. And this is just, I was telling you about that experiment we did growing maize and its wild ancestor teosinte in the much lower CO2 and temperature conditions that existed between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago when it was first cultivated and domesticated. And here was maize grown. We did this in growing chambers where we were able to manipulate the CO2 and temperature. Here was our maize grown in modern conditions, a nice big cob. Here was maize grown in 9,000 and 8,000 BP CO2 and temperature, 265 parts per million CO2. Right now it's about 414 parts per million. Temperature about 23 degrees centigrade. It's 26 to 27 degrees centigrade in Mexico now. And you can see how small the cob was. So maize was probably fighting lower CO2 than it liked initially. It's a C4 plant, uses a C4 photosynthesis pathway. And maybe this is part of the reason why it took so long for maize to become a truly productive crop and large cob. It may have been fighting lower CO2 and temperature levels than it really liked. And then this is a slide that Jeff Rossi-Barra, the geneticist I collaborated with, put together on, we call it Maize Moving. It's on Figshare, you can download it. And we put together all the evidence. And this shows how and when maize moved all over North and South America. And then in 1493, it was taken from the Caribbean into Spain. Okay, so that's all I have to say. And I'd be very happy to take any of your questions or go over any of these slides again, because I know I went through them pretty quickly. And we can go over slides without my telephone ringing too, if you would like. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dolores. Very much appreciated. As we said, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I was going to ask a question, which is, why did people around the world become farmers? More specifically, why do they decide to grow maize when the previous 3 million years of humans spent their time as hunter-gatherers? If we could talk a little bit about that.
That's a really good question. And amongst all the people interested in agriculture, there's no consensus on this. So if you ask 5 different people, you may get at least 4 different answers. I'll tell you my view. The lower CO2 and temperature was inhibitory to the growth of many of our crops. And the other thing is, before about 10,000 years ago, there were a lot of animals on the landscape that people certainly hunted. They went extinct. Mammoths and mastodons and other large animals. There were gigantic tree sloths. And my theory, my hypothesis, that there's something called behavioral ecology optimal foraging theory. I don't think it was worth the bang for the buck for people to invest in farming. Before CO2 did elevate greatly, so 12,000 years ago, we were in an ice age, and CO2 was much, much lower than it was today, 180 parts per million. It began to rise about 15,000 years ago, so that by 11 to 10,000 years ago, it got up to 265 parts per million. That experiment that we did growing corn and teosinte in past lower CO2 and temperature showed that at about 10,000 BP CO2 and temperature, it was a much more highly productive crop than it was in the thousands of years before that, when CO2 was still lower. So I think a couple things went on. The big game animals that had been running around, the mammoths and mastodons, went extinct. Probably a combination of that big climate change at the end of the last ice age and also human hunting pressure. And I think then it became worthwhile for people to grow some crops. That would be my hypothesis. People would disagree with me, but it's a very interesting question that we're still intensively studying.
Awesome. I'm going to ask one more question, and then there's loads of questions in the chat now, but we'll maybe circle back around to some of them. Has teosinte become established in other locations throughout the world at prehistorical level?
Thankfully, no.
Okay.
we can't let teosinte grow in other parts of the world. No. No.
Okay.
It needs to remain where it's native. Yeah.
And then actually one more a taxonomy question. Is there a difference between corn and maize? The research articles more often use maize, especially outside of the United States. A little.
Yeah, the derivation of the word maize comes from the Spanish maíz, which in itself is very close to what the Taíno, so the native inhabitants of the Antilles, when Columbus got there, were the Taíno. They had an Arawak language, and they called it something very similar to maíz. The Spanish said maíz. Corn, of course, is a word in the Bible that refers to wheat. And a lot of people get confused to that. The corn in the Bible in the old world was wheat before maize got to Spain and then dispersed into other areas of Europe. Maize and corn, to me and to many others, are the same thing. We use maize in the scientific literature. I think I probably also use corn in my publications. So they're, at least to some of us, many of us, they're one and the same thing.
Awesome. So again, thank you so much for the presentation and the answers to the questions, and we'll loop back around at the end for the big question and answer session and maybe catch some of the ones that we have here in the chat. So now we're going to transition to Dr. Holland, and Erica is going to present a video to start lead into his presentation. So take it away, Erica.
One of the big challenges facing U.S. agriculture is climate change, and we need to maintain our agricultural productivity to feed a growing world population. And these twin challenges could be addressed to some extent by the introduction of new genetics for crops like corn. However, this adaptation barrier that we find in tropical corns means that we can't use these interesting varieties directly because they just don't flower at an appropriate time, and that prevents them from having good yields. So what we're trying to do is to understand how to overcome these barriers of adaptation through different methods of selection so that we can more quickly adapt these tropical corns to the US. And this may help us have new varieties that are going to withstand climate variability, hotter, drier conditions, and so forth that we may be facing in the near future. I was involved in a project and we evaluated the response to selection for earlier flowering in a population of corn that came from the Caribbean called Tucson. This population, when it was originally brought to the US, was very late flowering, grew very tall, but didn't produce a lot of seed because it flowered too late. And this is very typical of tropical corns. And what's happening is they respond to our long day lengths by delaying their own flowering. So we demonstrated that selection for earliness over 10 generations essentially produced an adapted type variety that could be grown in the Midwest of the United States. And we studied the genetics of this and demonstrated that there were several really important genes that were involved in this adaptational process, and many, many, many others that had very small effects, but cumulatively also contributed to this response. There are some benefits that are coming out relatively quickly, and this is through our collaboration with projects like the Germplasm Enhancement of Maize program, which is releasing new inbred lines with tropical genetics, but in really very elite commercial ready backgrounds. And these lines are being used right now by both small and large seed companies in the US. In addition, the specialty populations that we're developing, we will have populations ready to release to farmers within the next 5 years.
All right. With that video, we will transition to Dr. Holland. Take it away, Dr. Holland, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting, and thanks for the organizers. This looks like a great series. And as Dr. Paperno said, she covered the early history of maize, the domestication, and I'm taking over from, I don't know, let's say 5,000 years ago to now. And actually, Dr. Paperno already showed this slide. This is that huge transition that occurred in the period between 9,000 and let's say 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, where maize was domesticated from this wild ancestor teosinte in the southern region of Mexico. And these ancient corns were developed that, as she showed you, had quite small ears, just a few kernel row numbers, but this represented a major advance in agricultural productivity because corn is much easier to harvest. The seeds all stay together on this cob, and the seeds are the nutritious part of the seed is exposed and easy to turn into food and eat compared to the wild ancestor. And what happens after that time, and actually she had a much better slide than this, but this is showing the same story of the dispersal of maize out of the center of origin. So the center of origin is right here, and these colors represent how old the archaeological remains of maize are. And these are the oldest ones in the center of domestication, and then it radiates out, and you can see it went into South America, through Central America into South America, and also 4,000 or 5,000 years ago moved up into the southwestern US, and about 2,000 years ago then maize transitioned into the eastern part of the US and all the way up into Canada. the key thing I want to get across here is that this process of geographic diversification was accompanied by selection by humans for different types, and I'll show you some of the variety was developed that way. And all of this happened before Europeans arrived in the Americas, or at least what I'm showing here all happened. And most of the diversity was generated before European contact. So this is a picture of the ecological zones of Mexico. And this is a study I participated in where we looked at associations between the different varieties of corn in Mexico and the different ecological zones. And we showed that there was a pretty clear correlation. Different varieties of corn are grown in different regions of Mexico, and the ecological diversity across Mexico is really huge. So if you go across all the Americas, it's really diverse. But even within Mexico, you have quite a diversity, and you have lowland tropics with a lot of humidity, a lot of rainfall. It's very hot. But you also have much drier areas. You have highlands, they all have very distinct environments. And so there was this process of natural selection where only the corns that could survive in these different regions were able to be maintained. And on top of that, you have humans who are selecting different varieties they like. They're trading seeds. They're moving the seeds through migration into different areas, but they're also selecting the different forms, the different ear types, the different kernel types, and the seed colors and things like that. This is largely due to human selection, kind of in parallel or on top of the natural selection. So these two processes generated massive diversity in corn in the Americas. So the result of this process, these two kind of evolutionary processes going on simultaneously, are what we call land races. Sometimes they're called heirloom varieties. I'll sometimes say open pollinated varieties, and I'm going to kind of use these things all interchangeably. This is a population of corn that's distinct in some way, typically has a particular ear seed type, and is adapted to a specific region. And the farmers in that region maintain their own populations. They save the seed of the plants they like, and they replant those year after year. And actually, those farmers are the ones driving this breeding process. And again, the result of that is this massive variation and the development of specialty things like sweet corn, popcorn. All that was created by the ancient indigenous farmers of the Americas. So again, this is just another picture of the diversity of maize types within Mexico. You have thousands of these unique land races existing before Europeans arrived. And then, as Dolores already said, after European contact, very quickly maize then got spread into Europe and then into Africa and China. And different varieties were developed in those regions of the world. In the eastern part of the US in the 17 to 1800s, one important thing that happened was there was a mixing of two older types. The older types were called the northern flints and the southern dents. And when those two things kind of came together and got mixed in kind of the eastern central Corn Belt region, that developed a new kind of mixed variety or a hybrid type that was called the Corn Belt dents. And these were really highly productive in that Midwestern Corn Belt region of the US. And the field corn that's grown in the US today, the commercial hybrid varieties that are grown, those are all primarily from that original mixing of the southern dent and the northern flints to produce these Corn Belt dents. So the process was this really dramatic diversification. And then in the US, we had this transition to basically a single type for our field corn, and that's the Corn Belt dents. The other thing that happened after the development of that Corn Belt dent sort of population, then there was the development of the inbred hybrid breeding method. And this came about in the early part of the 1900s. And the idea was that you could develop inbred lines of corn or maize. And you make an inbred line because you can take the pollen from a plant of corn and you can apply it to the ear of the same plant. That's called self-pollination, and that's a pretty extreme form of inbreeding. And if you repeat that process over 5 or 6 generations, what you'll come up with is a what we call an inbred line, where all the plants in the line are essentially genetically identical. They all tend to be pretty weak. So the original inbred lines that were developed were not very productive at all. They were very weak. And you might think, well, why would anyone do this? The advantage of this is if you can cross 2 unrelated inbred lines and develop what's called an F1 hybrid, which can be extremely uniform, have very high yield, and the uniformity allows farmers to kind of harvest everything at the same time, and it leads to this efficiency that that basically sort of modern farming methods depend upon. So the process in the US is the release commercially of the first F1 hybrid varieties in the 1930s. And very quickly, these are adopted by farmers because farmers recognize that both the uniformity and the high yield are really advantageous to their farming systems. And by 1960, you have hybrids on almost 100% of the corn growing acreage in the US. So the other 1% are things like sweet corn, popcorn, and very much kind of in the fringes, a very small proportion of the acreage is still maintained as these old varieties. But most of those old varieties get replaced by hybrid corn. So that hybrid corn is associated with these yield gains. So you can see that the yields just really taken off and have continued going up. And our best estimates that at least 50% of this yield gain is due to genetic improvement. So the seed companies are developing new inbred lines year after year, making new F1 hybrid combinations, and they market those to the farmers. The farmers have to buy F1 seed every year because if they save seed from their F1 varieties, it's now not an F1 anymore, it's called an F2, and you have a loss of yield and you have the loss of uniformity. So what happens is farmers now become dependent or reliant upon the seed companies for their seed. And the populations that they were growing before, they stop growing those, and eventually the seeds become inviable and they're no longer grown. And so what happens is that many of those old populations were lost. During the time when the hybrids were really taking over, though, some scientists recognized that, oh, we're actually losing a huge amount of diversity in these open pollinated varieties and these land races. And they organized collections both in the US and really throughout Latin America. There was really good systematic collections of the indigenous varieties. Those were then put into what we call seed banks. And here's some pictures. This is from the International Center called CIMMYT in Mexico. And the USDA also has a very important collection in Iowa. And there's many tens of thousands of unique varieties held by these collections. And in addition to that, not all the old varieties were lost on the farm. A few individual farmers sort of maintained the old varieties because they liked the kind of food they made, or they had some other special properties that they wanted to maintain. And some of the Native American tribes also maintained their varieties. And our next speaker will talk more about that. But also, you may have heard about this in the news. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. This is up in the Arctic Circle in Norway. And this is kind of the backup collection for all the other national and international collections. So they have seed samples from all over the world, from all different crops there, in case there are problems with any of these collections. You know, if there's a flood or the power goes out and the seeds become inviable, there is this international backup here. And then just a quick pitch. I won't say much about this because actually the video covered a lot of this. That one of the things we're doing in USDA research and in collaboration with our colleagues here at NC State and other universities is, again, to try to diversify the Corn Belt dents by bringing in what we think are useful genes from tropical maize, because tropical maize has much more genetic variation, and we think it has useful genes for continued yield improvement and climate resilience and things like that. The problem, as I mentioned, was that you have this day length sensitivity. So if you just grow tropical corn in our environment or in the problem's even worse as you go into the upper Midwest. We have very long day lengths in the summer, and that corn just keeps growing vegetatively. It's waiting for a short day to transition to flowering. And so they flower far too late, and they basically don't produce seeds, or they produce very few seeds. So we've studied the genetics of that process and the breeding methods to try to incorporate it. And we work with the USDA germplasm enhancement of maize program to try to basically develop new inbred lines that can be used by commercial seed companies for essentially that corn belt dent, field corn group. And then the other thing we're looking at is all these sort of old varieties, heirloom varieties, heritage varieties, and where we know there's a lot of diversity there. We don't have the adaptation problems. They're already adapted to our area. And these varieties have special culinary uses. And I'll just point out a few things. I have a few of these in my office, if I can hold them up in front of the camera. And I just want to show you kind of what these things look like in scale. This is a variety called Britain Flint. You can see it's a very long, thin cob and has just 8 rows of seeds on it. This is probably what the really old indigenous corns in our area looked like. They had these very long, thin cobs with very few kernel rows. And then probably just before, or just around the time of European contact, in our area, you've got these new varieties appearing that had many more rows of seeds. This is a variety called Gourd Seed because the seeds look like little pumpkin seeds. And this was quite productive in the southern region. This is when we talk about the southern dents, this is kind of a subgroup of the southern dents. And you also have other things in our area. This is Hickory King, which is kind of intermediate between. It has 10 rows of seeds. The seeds are really wide. So this is a really nice hominy corn. It can also be eaten fresh roasted. And this was really widespread through our region as well. And then in addition to that, you have these things like this is a Bloody Butcher. This is also widespread throughout the Southeast. It has these beautiful, very deep red cobs. You have the ornamental varieties that have the beautiful variegated coloring patterns on them. You see these, at Thanksgiving. These are sold at the farmer's market. So they're very beautiful. And then this is just an example of a variety that, to my understanding, was only maintained by, I think, one farmer in South Carolina. This is called Sea Island Flint. And I had never heard of this variety before. I didn't know it existed until a few years ago when colleagues at Clemson and University of South Carolina pointed this out, that there was this farmer growing this. And we've gotten seed samples of that, and we increased it and deposited in the USDA seed bank, so that now it's in the seed bank so other people are able to get it. So these are kind of the activities that we do in our research program to try to foment the growing of these specialty varieties as well. And the main reason we want to do that is because the corn belt dent types that are grown on most of the acreage in the US, the vast majority of that is used for animal feed and for ethanol, things like that, or for processing. It's not really eaten as food directly, but the food culture is really important in many parts of the world, and corn is a really critical piece of the food culture. And here on the left-hand side, I've just shown a few examples of how corn is eaten in Mexico. So in Mexico, the food culture of corn is really vibrant, really alive, and it's really incredible. And in addition, they've maintained the genetic diversity of all these different specialty varieties that kind of is the where the seeds come from that are used in this food culture. And we don't really have that level of food culture here, but there's really interest in kind of bringing this back. And in the southeastern area of the U.S., we do have important corn food uses like grits and cornbread and hominy corn. And there are chefs in our area who are really interested in saying, what kind of variety do I need? A special variety to make this kind of grits? And apparently there are quite important differences among varieties and how they produce these food types. And people are very interested in this now. And some people will pay additional money for these heirloom varieties. So we're trying to work with farmers and chefs to revitalize this segment. And then the last little bit, I'll only say a little bit about, because our next speaker is going to talk about how the Pawnee have maintained their own varieties. But in our region in particular, some of the tribal groups, the Native American tribal groups, lost their varieties. They were not able to maintain them because of the pressures of cultural colonialism. And so we've worked with some of these groups to try to identify some of these collections in the seed bank that we think really represent what we think was probably their ancestral corn. And we're trying to work with them to get the seeds back in their hands and to help them revitalize this important cultural aspect of growing corn. And I will stop there, and I don't know if I have time for questions, and I'll quit there.
Outstanding, Jim. Thanks so much for the presentation, the video, and the actual artifacts to share with us on screen. That was really great. I have a really good, quick, I don't know how easy the question is, but can you describe what the reason is for the change in the seed colors?
Well, we know the genetics of the seed colors are quite well understood. We know most of the genes involved. Mm-hmm. So essentially there's natural variation for whether a seed is going to have a yellow color or a white colored endosperm. And there's also natural variation for whether you make the blues or the red type colors, and they're different kind of biochemical pathways. But essentially all that variation was existing in maize thousands and thousands of years ago. And then basically humans would see colors they liked and just select the color types they liked. And when you continually breed for that process, you can develop these really novel forms for that.
Cool. Another question we have is about the nomenclature, the names for the corn from Mexico. Could you speak a little bit about do any of the names, are there any native names or names that come with the corn from Mexico? Because that wasn't as clear in the presentation as it might have been.
Yeah, right. So the land races of Mexico, they have kind of names sort of recognized by most maize scientists, and would also be recognized typically by the local people. Local folks also will just attach different places will call the same kind of corn different things sometimes, but we have kind of agreed upon land race names.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think if there's any of those names that have carried over into the US, and I'm not thinking of any. The types of variety names we have in the US are all different than the names that are used in Mexico. But we do know that there are some similarities. We do have some varieties that are in our area that are very similar. So we call this gourd. Okay, here's a good example. This is gourd seed, as I mentioned. Mm-hmm. In Mexico, there's a variety called Perpetuation. It looks almost exactly the same in terms of the ear and the cob. And Perpetuation basically means, the translation would be gourd seed. So that may be a case of where, the name may have come along with the corn. But in most cases, the names we have here in the US are often a descriptive name in English. Often they're a descriptive name from an indigenous language, or they may be the name of a farm, typically. So there has been, in most cases, kind of a break in the linkage of the naming of varieties between Mexico and the US.
Okay, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge the vigorous engagement on the questions within the chat. So some we're covering them at the same time, both in the conversation and in the chat. I'm going to ask one last question, and it is, are there differences in susceptibility to fungi, particularly toxin producing fungi between corn types? Were any older varieties less susceptible?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there are big differences. That's actually that's a big part of my research program is doing the genetics and breeding of the resistance to the ear molds, and the fungi that cause those ear molds can also produce toxins. And so we're trying to select varieties that have reduced levels of toxins. There's also huge variability. There are some varieties that are very susceptible and will get these ear molds quite badly, and they can get a lot of the mycotoxins. There's other varieties. There's nothing that's completely resistant, but there are other varieties where there's quite good levels of resistance, and they tend to not get the mycotoxins as much. If you go to the older varieties, you see that same range. Some of them are really pretty good for resistance. Many of them are also not very good and can be quite susceptible. And so this is one of the things we're trying to be careful with in the culinary corn movement, is to make sure that the varieties that are growing in a particular region are adapted to that region, so that they will have the resistance to the diseases that occur in that area.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Holland, for your presentation and the question and answer. And we will now transition to our next speaker, Ms. Electa Hare Redcorn from the Intertribal Agriculture Council and the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society. And Jim gave a little bit of a preview, and would like to turn it over to Ms. Hare Redcorn now.
All right, Noah. Hello.
We can hear you.
Thank
Awesome.
you. My name is Electa Hare Redcorn, and I am a student of public policy at the University of Arkansas. I am making sure you can see me too. There we go. All right. I'm sharing the screen here. And I just wanted to say thank you for giving us the opportunity to come and work with you on this important topic. I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, and I'd like to say thank you to Paul, to Erica, to Wendy, to Patrice, and to our translator, and to the other speakers today. Da'achikstehu, that means thank you in Pawnee. I am representing the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society today, and I am just very humbled and grateful to be here. And I'm here with my daughter, Signe. She's 9 years old. She's been with me on the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society since 2013, when she was in my stomach, when she was in utero. So she has traveled to the Nebraska homelands where Pawnee people are from. We currently reside in Oklahoma, in Pawnee County, Pawnee Nation Reserve. But she's been with me this whole ride, and so I thought it important that she come along with me today. While I'm presenting, she has been processing some varieties of our corn, and so I just want to thank her for her work and her play and her participation today. All right, so the topic of my presentation is the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society, and behind that is the spirit and intention of an ag biodiversity movement. I'm thankful for Tony Stenger of the Native American Agriculture Fund and other key leaders who have encouraged me to study, to actively participate, and to make connections with the USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, my home tribe, and other chefs, gardeners, growers, and student interns to make this dream a reality. In my first slide here, you'll see Laura Mae Melton. She's Pawnee. She's a seed blesser. Her mother was a nurse at an Indian Health Service facility in Pawnee for many decades. And she views our seed and our corn as medicine. Over here is Deb Echohawk. She's the executive director of our Pawnee Seed Preservation Society. And she has been a mentor to me since 2011 when I first joined the Seed Project. I am an MSW. So prior to me joining the Seed Project as an intern manager coordinator, I was a social worker in a clinical setting, asked to study, interpret, and encourage others to pursue their strengths in a mental health and socio-ecological approach to wellness. On our team, the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society, you'll see Deb Echohawk and Ronnie O'Brien here This name here, Irari Dikiskiripaki, means little corn sister. It was a name that was given to her. Ronnie is a super special human to us. Ronnie lives in Shelton, Nebraska, and she worked at the Kearney Visitor Center in Kearney, Nebraska. It's a highway visitor stop. She noticed that Pawnees were not being represented in the narrative of the historical travel stop. So the most sincere gesture that she could do was to begin to plant Pawnee corn at that travel stop garden site. And they decided, when she made contact with our Pawnee Nation, she cold called. She said, it's important that we grow Pawnee corn on Pawnee homelands. And when she said that, something clicked. Deb, having a background in seed preservation and perpetuation back in Colorado in her younger years, she said, yes, this is exactly what we need. And how do we get this done? Well, we still have a traditional council of chiefs, our Pawnee Nashado Council. They help us make important cultural decisions. They also lead us in spiritual inquiries. They're very integral to our modern day governance. And I'm very blessed to have them because they have blessed me in return. On the screen here also is Kahita Barnoski. Kahita is a Pawnee woman. She's also Muskogee Creek. And she actually is a student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln today as a she studies land race varieties of maize. That's what the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Master's Study in Horticulture, that's what they have deemed her as. But she entered the Pawnee Seed Project as an intern, and I was grateful to be her mentor in the summer of 2017. If you'd like to follow along on our social media, we have Pawnee Seed Preservation Society, and we do have a website. There are articles about us if you'd like to read more, but we just want to let our audience know that our seed, our mother corn, Atira de Kisu, it's a relative to us, it's special to us, and it is still alive. And we're so grateful for that and all the partners that have helped us get to the point where we are today to have a Pawnee Seed Library, a Pawnee Seed Bank, and an active interest in perpetuating the seed. So this slide here is actually a picture of Deb, Ronnie, and myself with my third daughter presenting to the USDA Lincoln office. We had driven up in November, so we shared a meal. There was a wild game, there was traditional foods. We brought some blue corn mush, and we were sharing it as a seed preservation project. And over time, we've developed to a seed preservation society. And included in that is education, outreach, collaborations, research partnerships, policy implementation. All of these things are important to reconnect Indigenous communities with our soil, our seeds, and our culture. Pawnee, thank you. Okay, thank you. Pawnee seeds are intrinsically tied to our stars and our belief system of the cosmology of our stars. They are a part of our origin story, and they led our hunting and our growing and our agricultural practices that we did practice prior to the 1870s in Nebraska along the Loup, Platte, and Republic rivers. So that's our homeland. You can see that we have earth lodges that maybe up to 40 people of a certain clan or band would live in. And we actively have those bands today. I'm Parus Katari Idau. I am of the Pita Hawirata band of the Pawnee people. So we would have our own village and our own earth lodges there in Nebraska. And we were displaced down to Oklahoma in the 1870s, ceded through treaty rights, but also highly encouraged by the government at the time to move on down to Oklahoma with the other nations to Indian Territory. So this is how we lived before. It's important to capture and archive our artwork and our stories and our narratives through artist renditions of the stories that have been passed down. So that's why we do include artwork in our presentation, because it shows that whole ecological interaction between the animals, the plants, the waterways, and ourselves. These are our ancestors and our leadership. I was encouraged last night to remember that all of these faces, all of their lives, all of their losses, the movement down to Oklahoma, they have all been a part of our story of reclaiming these seeds. And I want to acknowledge them today. Pawnee people were always known as we tried to maintain peace, but we also had to protect our corn and our food supplies and our caches against other neighboring tribes, but also because of that westward expansion that caused us to have this spirit of competition. So in this image, you can see the railroad coming across the west. And what this is a representation of the Pawnees merging into this new society, merging in an understanding of our place on the plains. And also we were significant protectors of the expansion. Please don't swing that, baby. Significant protectors of the expansion of the railroad across the US, which sometimes is viewed as contradictory, and I can understand why. But we saw the United States government as allies and protection. And now we know more of the story, we know more of the narrative, but it's important to acknowledge that we played a significant role in protecting some of the growth of the United States. Here's us transporting our homes and our culture, probably our seeds prior to colonization. Today, the Pawnee do live on a reserve and a community of Pawnee, Oklahoma. There was a time period, and still to this day, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs had an agent who would oversee the distribution of funds, distribution of rations of commodity foods that were unfamiliar to us and that we had to adapt to. And with that adaptation was the introduction of diseases, obesity, inflammation, chronic diseases. Today, we see things that are related to our diet, like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, things that we did not have before, but are an issue today. And so the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society has built a community of practice to reintroduce Pawnee seeds, Pawnee nutrition, Pawnee spirituality, and Pawnee culture to our contemporary society. As I mentioned before, and if I didn't say it clearly, we view corn as our relative, Atira de Kisu. Atira de Kisu is our mother. And as you can see, we hold our mother very closely. Here is Nora Tilden Pratt. She was an elder when I was in probably my daughter's age, when I was 9, 8, 7, running around Pawnee, Oklahoma at the dances. We still have our dances actively today. And here in this picture is a rendition of her saying a prayer over each seed. And I don't think that's an unfamiliar concept, because I went to a shrimp boat blessing in Louisiana last spring, and it was April 25th. And what they said in that shrimp boat blessing was beautiful. It was in Dulac, Louisiana, and it was similar to how we believe, because they said, bless your work and bless your play. And so when you hear that and you see that, I want you to accept that as bless your work and bless your play, and that your work is important, and that we have to rely on each other to continue these food systems and these traditional ecological knowledges. So thank you for taking time with Nora and I today as we continue sharing. So she's praying over each seed. And that's something that my interns beside me, not under me, but beside me, have taught me, is that we still pray over each seed. And that's been a beautiful thing. Okay. So these are some varieties of corn that were believed to have been brought down from Nebraska. There was a time, like I said, when we lived in Earth Lodge villages, we came from the stars. The Pawnees have always had seed keepers, and we kept our seeds in traditional not always like a parfleche, but a traditional bundle of prayers and medicines and such vital instruments of our spirituality. And so when we moved from Nebraska to Oklahoma, if you were forced to leave your home and you couldn't take much with you, you couldn't take your earth lodge with you, what could you take? Well, we tried our best to take our bundles and our seeds, but we also knew there was a conflict of spiritual practices. There was a conflict of life ways. And so walking down from Nebraska to Oklahoma, some of our tribal members, we did lose a significant number to illness and death on that walk. But we also remembered how spiritual that corn is to us. And some of our tribal members walking down from Nebraska set the bundles, set the medicines back into the trees, because we knew when we get to Oklahoma, we were uncertain and we didn't know how to care for them. And so today and over time, there have been farmers and ranchers, farmers in Nebraska who have found caches of Pawnee seed on land that they farmed since colonization, since the settler movement. But we also know that tribal members held the corn and the seed and the kisu so close to our hearts and our life way that many of them took seed with us. That's all we could take with us. You know, it was a march. It was a forced march. And so it's been a beautiful thing for us to regenerate our seeds based upon some of the seeds that we had found in storage, the interest of Ronnie O'Brien at Nebraska Kearney, and just other Nebraska farmers who have helped us continue our cause and our reconnection to our culture. So you can see here, our Pawnee hand carried those seeds from the homeland to present day Pawnee, Oklahoma, over 149 years ago. These are some seeds that we've been able to regenerate as of yet today. I have a lot of pictures and I'm going to go through them because my time is limited today, but I'd love to continue the conversation and actually come do some research at the USDA Ag Library and exchange and learn with you. So the seed bank has 19 varieties of Pawnee corn today and other crops, including squash, painted like a horse bush beans, magpie beans, Pawnee Arikara watermelon. Arikara were our relatives to the north, and the Wichita are our relatives to the south that we still engage in cultural exchange. We still get together and play traditional gambling games. And we've started conversations about farming, gardening, sharing food, and reestablishing some of our regional trade routes. We've worked very hard since at least 2001, with intensive years in 2011, 2012, through 2022, to, as Dr. Holland mentioned, to hand select the seed that will propagate farther, learning that we need to plant at least 100 seed every time we garden. We have attended agricultural biodiversity fairs in Oaxaca and Zapatas Union. We attended regional food summits on behalf of Intertribal Ag Council to learn about regional food exchanges and cultural practices and how we're similar in our practices. And then we also have partners in Nebraska, like the scientist, Dr. Tom Hogemeyer, who has led us gingerly through some conversations about plant hybrid behaviors and also agricultural biodiversity. So we do have some partners, but we also have an air of protection about our work because we don't want to lose our seed again. We've lost it before. We know what that feels like spiritually, culturally, economically. And so we gingerly approach this with the leadership, under the leadership of our chiefs. So here's some beautiful growth photos, and Paul is going to be able to give me the smile to let me know when my time is out, but I'm just going to keep on sharing until it's over. So the silks here are actually beneficial to all people to reduce inflammation as a tea. We have interns in the background of my photos who are doing some data collection. That's Kahita from my first slide, the student at University of Lincoln, Nebraska. And she actually worked with a GPS mapper to kind of map out where in Nebraska along the Platte, Loop, and Republic Rivers where we have been growing gardens. And this is the map of the 2019 gardens that we had established. I just really also want to acknowledge that many of our growers in 2019 and 2020 specifically were significantly impacted by COVID, lost relatives. You know, it was a hard year to maintain these ag practices, but in partnership, growing our corn in Nebraska on regenerative ag practices and cover cropping technologies, we have been able to get this far, and we're really dedicated to the cause. You can see here there's corn growing in the tassels, which is a trait that Dr. Holland probably could talk about more in question and answer if he wanted to. Here we are hard at it. This is an Pawnee artist who committed a summer. This is myself, a former social worker who now is a public policy student. Kahita, I interviewed her and Mikai, who is now the diabetes and wellness coordinator for the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. And so it's about development of the individual, but also development of the community. And Kahita, when I interviewed her, I did ask her, so how do you see yourself as part of our food system? Do you know what a food system is? And she said, well, I eat. And at that point in 2017, she knew that she ate. But today she's going to be one of our leading research scientists in raised land varieties, or land-raised varieties of maize. So I just want to congratulate her success and commitment. This is Mikai, and she was teaching me how to pray over each seed like Nora Pratt had taught us in that image. This is a harvest camp that we had last summer. We were all afraid and leery to converge because of COVID restrictions, but we also knew if we wanted corn to eat at our ceremonies and make it a living thing, it is a living thing to us, and we had to run our culture camp, our corn camp, and this was in Nebraska last October. Here is a tribal citizen from Seattle who flew in just for the harvest camp. This is some of our Pawnee Eagle corn. It has a tiny eagle fleck on each one, on each kernel. Here we are. We went ahead and harvested it at the milky stage, and then we blanched it. My mother blanched it. And then we, of course, I lost the words, and maybe I need a Pawnee word for this, but we prepared it into ceremonial dried corn. And so we don't have to rely on an overpriced vendor. We can do it ourselves, and that's a beautiful thing. This is one of our chiefs today, Pat Leading Fox, and he brought his entire family and his daughters and his wife, and we're grateful for the prayers that he offered over the harvest camp. This is my very driven mentor, Deb Eckelhawk. And she left a sentiment that our community is growing more aware of the gardening, that it brings us joy, that we are enlightened and always encouraged when we hear a youth say they want to be a corn grower, a seed keeper, or a farmer. We've skipped some generations, as you can tell from my presentation, and now it's time to revitalize and perpetuate the seed, as it is so important to our culture. Also, there are some filmmakers who have followed our work, and also some academics and researchers. They're seeing their story in our story. And so we hope to be a technical assistance support to other tribes who are renaturating their corn. And sometimes to renaturate the corn, we have to approach the USDA seed bank. Sometimes we have to approach those non-native farmers who may have old farmhouses and may have caches on their land and properties. Sometimes they donate their land back through land tenure so we can grow corn again. We're in the process of doing that right now. But it's really nice to know that other tribal, indigenous people recognize the spiritual aspect, how sacred corn is to us, and how it will honestly turn around the nutrition, obesity, and health issues that we do face today due to the traditional high sugar, low nutrient diet that we have been exposed to. So if you'd like to learn more, Deb Eckelhawk is our executive director. Gina is our managing director, doing wonderful work on the ground. These ladies never stop processing corn. We are looking for more ways to supplement our processing equipment. At this current time, for the last 5 years, we have processed our blue corn from kernel to a ground corn. And we did that utilizing a steam engine thresher from the 1890s that we have a Pawnee, a Pawnee County has a steam engine show. So any steam engine enthusiasts from that era, they come out with their tractors and their equipment. Well, we have a wonderful partner, Marneth Holsington from Oklahoma State University, who brings her equipment and we grind it into meal. And then we sell that as a donation base, basically a gift offering that if people want to support the project, they can purchase the meal. We have partners in Mexico. We have AmeriCorps Vistas on site. We're growing, but we're also still educating our own community members about the nutritional value of our corn because we have been disconnected it for generations. So I am so grateful for time. I think it's time for questions. And I'm happy again to share this space with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your interaction with us today. We very much appreciate the content and the presentation. We have some questions in the chat, and the first one I wanted to ask from the chat is, hold on a second. What happened to it? Yes. Does the Pawnee Seed Bank have a field day or a demonstration day? And can people come in and observe? And particularly in 2022, you gave us all the contact information, which we can look at and post. But I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that at all.
Thank you. So, it's a delicate and sensitive growing process for our corn. But the beautiful thing is that we have developed the harvest camp. And we do have supporters, friends, allies, and colleagues who do come out and help us with that processing. The timing of it is always kind of tough because we have a 2-week, maybe a 3-day window actually of when it gets to the milky stage. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know corn, you probably all do because you're on this call, but corn is milky when you can just touch the kernel and it'll shoot a little stream of that sugary substance out, the juice of the corn. And so that is the point when we converge and we harvest it. And so if we miss that 3-day window, then it kind of moves on to the next stage of turning into a harder seed. And then it's harder to turn into ceremonial dried super corn. So around August, September, October, probably August, you want to start watching our social media and then reach out to Deb Echohawk and come on out maybe for the harvesting support in Nebraska. We're trying to grow corn in Oklahoma as well. And I guess the last point I wanted to make is every spring around Earth Day, we do a seed blessing where we do pray over the project, the seed, the provenance, the continuation of the seed, and remembering those ancestors that we featured in that photo. So we have days in April and days in August through October that we are definitely more active. And then the first weekend of May, we can always use volunteers to help with the grinding of the corn. We also are looking for contemporary equipment, but in the meantime, we use the steam threshing technologies.
Awesome. Thank you. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what does the perpetuation of seeds mean to your community and tribe, and why is this? You've talked a little bit about it, but if you could talk a little bit more about why it's so important.
So I have seen in the chat, and as not only an act of governmental sovereignty of our tribal nation, but culture, language, our traditional foods, our practices, our scientific, the basis of our scientific knowledge comes from being citizen scientists growing corn. And so as we recognize that, we become in control of our health policy. We can see that we're actively working to ensure that everyone in our community is able to live a healthier life, that we can change some things in our community to eliminate the inequities of not having access to our corn, that we can listen to the ideas of our youth and our elders because they have this corn memory that we can recall upon, and that we can help our individual and family members of our tribe and our Pawnee community and Oklahoma and our region and the nation move the needle towards a healthier way of living. And corn is one way to do that. And so I had an interview yesterday and they said, being on the land is important to you, isn't it? And I said, it's very important. And I said, but it also helps me stay grounded in my own mental health and wellness. If I didn't have corn, if my children didn't have corn, if my aunties and Aunt Deb didn't have corn, that component to our spirituality on a nutritional basis, our foundations would be lost. So it's that important to us. And that's why we have implemented some protections. That's why we always go through our traditional council of chiefs to help us make decisions. And that's why we love to partner, but we also partner, like I said, in a protective, safe, like, is this a mutual relationship that we're both benefiting from in a good way that's not necessarily always a market-based way.
Thank you. I also wanted to, I know you're checking the chat, but I also want to acknowledge the appreciation that everyone in the group here has for your story and your presentation, and particularly the images that you shared with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wanted to maybe as a last question before we transition to the next part, if are there particular ways that the USDA, Agricultural Research Service, NRCS, and other parts of our department can better interact with the tribal community? We don't always have the best history in this area over long periods of time, but I'd be interested in hearing your views on what we can do and what we can do better.
Oh, thank you. I feel so honored and blessed. I'm just one face in among, talking on behalf of my Tribe Seed project, but there are 574 or more other tribes and some unrecognized tribes that deserve this due diligence and attention and support in growing our project. I would want to acknowledge that in my studies at the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative at the University of Arkansas, we do have a Native Youth into Agriculture movement. And we've partnered with other areas of the USDA before, but we'd love to maybe give the youth access to some of the ag library research. I'm going to include myself in there because I would take it important to really examine that narrative of the structure of our governance in this bureaucracy, and also understand that we can develop food and ag codes that have standing that are equal to federal standing, or just, like the sovereignty of our nations, the government to government relationship, that will be important in examining and upholding to reestablish these regional food and trade routes. So I'm really grateful to see other corn growers and other supporters on the chat. And also I would ask for USDA's support in some of the research and grant institutions like the different universities and 1896 universities. They have really thrived from that patent model. And we know that the USDA started under Lincoln's administration as a campaign promise to start a Department of Agriculture. But one thing that we need to do is acknowledge that, like, the first person he put in charge was Isaac Newton's nephew, and he was a patent officer himself. So the whole framework of seed patenting and that market, the capital-based market, is based on the patenting. And so that is one thing I would want to examine as an Indigenous person, is how has that impacted our food systems and the perpetuation of our different seed. So that's one thing I want to work on with you all at one point in time, but also consultation from government to government with tribal leaders in the rooms is important. Also, when you enter a tribal nation, to ask them if they have food and seed codes, basically food sovereignty codes in their constitution or their governance. And that is one activity that I will be participating with other Pawnee members starting this summer, is a look at our constitution to see where we can enhance those food sovereignty, violence against women, jurisdictional issues, government to government issues, that we can work alongside each other to support a food system that will last. So thank you.
Awesome. And thanks again for engaging with me in questions and answers from the group who's on the call today. At this point, I'd like to ask Pamela if she could, if we can go to our poll questions. We want to get a little bit of feedback from everybody as we come to a conclusion here today. And I believe we've got about 5 minutes or so. So we just want to gather some feedback so that we can be in a better place to be able to enhance the programming that we offer into the future. And you can see the first poll question. And I will defer to Pamela on when to end the poll based on the volume of responses that we have. All right.
Maybe 10 more seconds.
I hope this doesn't come across as inappropriate.
Okay, I think we can transition to the next poll question too. Thanks for the commentary in the chat. That's appreciated as well.
Yes, thank you. I also saw in the chat that there was questions about other linguistic words for corn. And I wanted to let people know that there are at least 40 terms in the Pawnee language for the growth of corn, the processes of corn, the small little sprouts, all the way to the harvesting. And that is a beautiful thing for us to do.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. And again, I'll defer to Pamela on how long we want to go with the second poll question to get the feedback.
Okay, about 10 more seconds and we'll end the poll.
All right, thank you. And as a reminder, we have recorded this session and we'll be capturing all of the questions that we have in the chat. And for ones that we didn't get to as part of the back and forth, we'll identify ways to make answers to the questions available up on our website as part of this 3-part webinar series. And as we kind of wrap this part up, I was wondering if any of our speakers wanted to ask any questions of the other speakers that presented earlier today, like a little bit of an open floor for a moment or two before we go into the final announcements. You know, Electa's still with us, and I thought I saw Jim and Dolores as well, but
Yeah, if I could ask Electa on the issue of seed sovereignty, do you have, I guess, what is the mechanism for ensuring that you're able to, I guess, control your own varieties?
You know, that's a great question. And as the families brought forth the seed from their bundles, you know, that's a very personal and, you know, spiritual, cultural, significant thing. And we understand that there could be a threat to that. We want to understand what those threats are, but we also want to understand how we can protect them further. So we look at frameworks like the UNIDRIP beyond the federal system, but also the UNIDRIP Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. We're looking at other WIPO acronyms are tough because there's so many, but there are different means and frameworks of protection that we are looking at. We're looking at intellectual properties. We're looking at tribal sovereignty is just following the steps to come in and do research in our communities. So there are many different tiers of what we're trying to focus, but the main thing we're trying to do is bring back these nutritional plants of landrace varieties to access, to touch, to feel, to pray with for our Pawnee people. And so, yes, there are means through policy, there are means through how we safely store, where we safely store, that we diversify where we store them. But also, it's in development. We're working with legal teams through the Native American Rights Funds and also other food sovereignty experts to see the best vehicle to
Did Aleka disappear? Oh, okay. All right. We will, I think we'll proceed to the end at this point. And again, like I said, we will share the recording of this presentation on our website. I also, as our speakers alluded to, first I want to thank our speakers again for their outstanding presentations and interactions with each other and with the group here today. I also want to give a big shout out to our team here at the National Ag Library who brought this program together. Wendy, Patrice, Ricardo, Vanessa, Erica, Pamela, Cynthia, Kirsten, Sandy, and Daniel. Thanks for being here and backing up all the different parts of the program. And I also want to encourage everyone to mark your calendar for our next event in the series, which will occur on Tuesday, July 26th, and it's entitled A Taste for Maize, More Than Popcorn and Corn on the Cob. Join our chefs as they conduct live recipe demonstrations and share their culinary knowledge. And there is, I think, a link, or there will be a link in the chat for how to connect, and there's a link on the slide there, and you'll see more announcements for this through different ARS, NAL, social media channels, and elsewhere. So with that, thank you for coming out today for our presentation, and we look forward to seeing you on July 26th. Thanks so much.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.